For the men fighting on the front lines of the Great War, death was a daily routine right under their very feet. The earth itself was completely drenched with blood, and the landscape was constantly churned with the bodies of fallen soldiers. Will Bird was a seasoned Canadian soldier who knew this reality all too well. Like most men in the trenches, he suffered from profound sleep deprivation. Catching a few hours of rest was nearly impossible, between the stray shells, sudden calls to arms, and the relentless pestering of trench rats. Feeling his eyes get heavy, Will was suddenly pulled back to consciousness by an unwelcome visitor. Mud-laden footsteps approached his cot in the dugout. A man stood there, smiling down at him in the dim, flickering lantern light. The face staring back at him belonged to his brother, Steve. Steve had been killed in action more than 2 years earlier. In an environment where death was omnipresent, the psychological barrier between the living and the dead began to fracture for these soldiers. When Will began to shout in shock, his brother quickly moved to silence him, pressing a palm firmly over his mouth. Will later documented exactly how that hand felt, entirely physical and surprisingly warm. Without a word, Steve signaled for Will to follow. Will grabbed his rifle and trailed his silent brother through the winding network of trenches. But after rounding a corner, Will found himself facing an empty path. Steve had vanished. Emotionally drained, Will wandered until he finally collapsed into a deep sleep. When he awoke and navigated back to his original dugout, he found a crater. Mere hours after his brother led him away, a massive artillery shell had completely obliterated the structure, leaving no survivors inside. Thousands of similar spectral sightings appear in official military records and personal diaries from the front. Will's account was part of a documented pattern shared by soldiers throughout the conflict. We have to figure out what was actually happening to these men. Were these widespread encounters a symptom of mass psychosis induced by trauma? Or did the horrors of the front actually tear the veil between life and death? Severe physical and mental exhaustion provides the modern psychological framework for analyzing these encounters. The human brain requires sleep and safety to maintain its grip on reality, and trench warfare offered neither. Soldiers were subjected to relentless environmental stressors. They endured endless artillery barrages, rampant disease, constant fear, and absolute exhaustion. This chart illustrates a mind under these conditions. As hours awake extend, cognitive stability crashes into a hallucination threshold, inducing waking dreams. This breakdown isn't random. A person's cultural background heavily dictates what their exhausted mind projects. Look at the demographics of the enlisted ranks. These men were largely blue-collar workers, farmhands, and miners. They were raised on local folklore and myth, making them culturally primed to interpret psychological anomalies as a supernatural sign or twist of fate. Extreme stress and cultural priming offer a tidy scientific explanation. Yet that theory struggles to account for the inescapable accuracy of many of these visions. If these sightings were solely protective psychological coping mechanisms, we have to ask why so many of them acted as terrifying harbingers of certain death. Take the account of a weary British line during a brutal firefight. They had successfully taken a ruined town, but were heavily battered and trying to hold their ground against a heavy German counterattack. Through the dense smoke and flying bullets, 2 soldiers noticed a bizarre sight. An older woman wearing a vibrant blue skirt and bonnet was standing directly in the middle of the street. She was completely stoic, entirely unfazed by the lethal battle raging around her. One of the young soldiers stared at the woman and went completely pale. He entered a deep trance, claimed his mother had come for him, and slowly walked out into the open crossfire. He was killed almost instantly. This encounter contradicts the idea of a protective hallucination. Instead, it appears to be a total psychological surrender to the inevitability of death. The phenomenon wasn't always visual. Consider the internal experience of Corporal Albert Davey. He was an elite veteran in the Australian Tunnelling Company, engineers tasked with the incredibly dangerous job of digging beneath enemy strongholds to plant explosives. In the final weeks of the war, when an Allied victory was almost certain, Davey was suddenly struck by an overwhelming, all-encompassing premonition of his own impending death. He didn't panic. He calmly approached his commanding officer, handed over his personal belongings, and asked that they be sent to his wife. He completely accepted his fate. The very next morning, while waiting for the advance, Davey was killed by a random shell. This presents a difficult problem for historians. These men were heavily trained weapons of war. Their absolute survival in the trenches depended entirely on their sharp senses and their highly accurate perception of reality. Decades later, when interviewed as rational older men, these veterans refused to recant or revise their stories. They stood by what they experienced, leaving us with a mystery that resists easy debunking. The trenches created a vacuum of personal control. A random artillery shell could wipe out a dugout in a fraction of a second, entirely regardless of a soldier's individual skill or bravery. In that environment, the two competing theories, genuine paranormal intervention and trauma-induced psychosis, ultimately serve the exact same function for the soldier. These visions brought order to total chaos. Whether the mind was projecting a hallucination or receiving a spiritual message, the result provided a life-saving warning, a final comfort, or the necessary peace to face an inescapable end. Modern science may never prove exactly what Will Bird or Corporal Davey saw. However, their meticulous accounts remain an undeniable documented part of human history. These phantom encounters revealed the profound resilience of the human mind when forced to survive at the absolute edge of endurance. They stand as a testament to the way we seek order in the face of the impossible.